Hey, I'm Timothy Snyder. It's February 6, 2018, and this is the latest in the series of little informal videos that we're doing about current events. What I'd like to talk to you today about is the con that is America First. One of the reasons I haven't done one of these for a bit is that I had to be over in Europe for a while, and while I was there, I had occasion to think about this. I had occasion to listen to Mr. Trump. I had occasion to listen to some European leaders and some Chinese leaders and some Russians and some other folks. And I think I figured out one of the reasons why the slogan America First bothers me so much. And the one reason is that it's a con. Now, how is it a con? There are three levels to this con, and I'm going to try to go through each one of them. The first con of America First is that it's a trick that tries to substitute foreign policy for domestic policy. So if you really believed in America First, what you would in fact believe in is Americans first. You would be saying we should have policy that will help Americans. And here the con is to say, well, the way to have policy to help Americans is to have tough trade policy against other people, Chinese, Russians, Europeans, whatever. That is fundamentally a con, because even if you had the best, most perfectly formulated, adjusted, adapted trade policy, that's not everything that Americans need. Americans need much more than that. So the first level of this con is that you're switching out foreign policy for domestic policy. And the deep, dark part of that con is that while you keep saying America First, what you're actually not doing is implementing any domestic policy for the Americans who need it most. So 1 year into the administration, is there any domestic policy that would help Americans, or in particular the Americans who voted for Mr. Trump, in the hope that their lives would get better? Is there a domestic policy to work against the educational inequalities, the opioid problems, all of the deep things that haunt the parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, places that voted for Mr. Trump, counties that voted for Mr. Trump, people who voted for Mr. Trump? What is the policy in the last year to help them? There's nothing. There's nothing. There's just the tax cuts for people who aren't them, and the vague assurance that somehow these tax cuts are going to help them. There's just the removal of the individual mandate, which will mean that 13 million or so Americans who need health insurance won't have it. There is no domestic policy. So this is the first way that America First is a con. It says our domestic policy is going to be a foreign policy, and then there's no domestic policy. Okay. The second way that America First is a con is that it's a foreign policy that is not, in fact, a foreign policy at all. What America has done in the last year is hit the pause button on its own power. What America has done in the last year is that it's gone from the country that has made the rules that were favorable to America in general, it should be said. It's gone from being the country that has made the rules to the country which has said, well, we're not sure what the rules are, and we're not really going to try to make them. Now, to see how this works, you have to think about America First as a conversation with other people. So America First is something that you say, right? The president says it. And to whom does he say it? Well, as we were talking about before, he says it to Americans as a con, so that Americans forget that we need domestic policy. But when he says it to others, he's saying it to foreigners, right? To heads of state, heads of government, people who are in charge of trade. So when Mr. Trump, as the President of the United States, says America First abroad, when he's talking to the Chinese, the Europeans, the Russians, whatever, he's having a conversation. Now, that seems like a really simple point, but it's very important to get this straight, because the moment you say America First, you're acknowledging that you're in a relationship with other countries. Otherwise, you wouldn't be saying America First, because to whom would you be saying it, right? So America First is a stance that you take. It's the first pose that you strike. It's the first phrase that you utter in your conversation with, in your relationship with other countries. You're in a relationship with other countries. That's inevitable. And the question is, how do you best pursue American interests in that relationship? Is the best way to pursue those interests striking a pose, stroking your own feathers, and saying America first? No, it's not. That's pretty much the worst possible way. Because what happens when you do that is you effectively say, we're not going to obey the rules. We're going to pull out of things we've agreed to do right and left. We're not going to acknowledge that there are rules. But we're also not going to provide any new rules. So in the first year of the Trump administration, has the United States succeeded in establishing any new rules for international trade? No. It's only junked rules that have already existed, right? So think about how this is incoherent. If you're the head of state, if you're the American president, and you say to other people, America first, how does that actually work as a relationship? What kind of relationship does that generate? So let's use some analogies. Imagine that, for example, you were with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and one day you woke up and you said, honey, from now on, it's going to be me first, right? So then your boyfriend, your girlfriend would say, okay, why don't you put your right foot first and then your left foot first and walk those 2 feet right out the door, right? Or imagine that, let's say you have kids. I've got kids. It's incoherent to say that now in my relationship to my children, it's going to be me first. It just doesn't make any sense because your whole sense of me, right, is involved in that relationship with the children. Or, okay, let's get, less homey and more practical. Let's imagine that you're at a four-way intersection. Okay, this is something that I live in New England, and so I face this every day because no one knows what the rules are. It's just like every time a car comes into a four-way intersection, it's like it's the first time it happens in history. So imagine you come to a four-way intersection and your principle was me first. What does that mean? It just means lots of accidents, right? There has to be some kind of rule, or take it to a higher level. Think about airports. What if the principle in landing a plane was America first, right? That American planes got to be the first to land every time. This would make no sense, right? So saying me first doesn't establish rules. It just creates confusion, and also it creates opportunities for other people. Let's look at that now practically. So from the point of view now, not of us, not of our president, but from the point of view of the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, what has just happened? What does America first mean? What does it mean when the single superpower in the world, the country which actually made the rules, says, we're not sure what the rules are, we don't have any new rules, we just want you to tell us that we're great? What does that mean for the rest of the world? Well, for the Europeans, what it means is a kind of opportunity. The Europeans were shocked by the election of Mr. Trump. They moved past it very quickly in a matter of 6 or 8 weeks. And now the story in European politics is, what are the things that we can now do to substitute for the vacuum of American leadership? Which means that Europeans are talking about things like common defense. Actually, they've already started it. They're talking about things on the domestic policy side like lifelong education, things that we should be talking about. All of this because they've basically been energized to fill the vacuum left by Mr. Trump, which is probably a good thing if you're European. If you're an American watching it, it's pretty unnerving. It's unnerving to watch people who actually have serious policy for the near future. What about the Chinese? How do the Chinese react to America first? The way the Chinese react to America first is to say, we never expected that the United States would yield to us so much influence so quickly. But if they're going to do it, we're ready. We will make our way across Eurasia. We've got our Silk Road project. We will slowly make our way, more or less tactfully, without too much noise, into the much greater role that Mr. Trump is giving us. That's the fundamental Chinese reaction. So to sum up, the second way that America first is a con is that America first as a foreign policy does not exist. It is the absence of a foreign policy. The advantage the United States always had as the world's leading economy is that the United States could set the rules. What America first does is that it says, we don't know what the rules are anymore. We're one of those countries who breaks the rules, and it has nothing else to say. This creates vacuums which other powers, whether it's the European Union or whether it's China, are going to fill in their own way. So America first is a con because it's also not a foreign policy, which brings us to Russia. This is the third con. So let's just forget for a second everything that I said and imagine that there is somebody out there in the world who really believes in America first. Okay, let's imagine that America first was a real policy, that there's somebody who actually believed that Donald Trump is putting America first. I hope, actually, there's nobody beyond the United States, by the way, who believes that. There's some Americans who believe it, but there's pretty much nobody in the US who thinks that America first is a policy or that it benefits Americans. But let's try hard for a second to imagine that America first is actually a policy. That we did actually have a policy, and that policy said, we're going to protect American interests using trade instruments against powers that show themselves to be hostile. Okay, let's imagine there was such a thing. There ain't, but let's imagine there was such a thing. Where then would we apply such a policy? Where would be the first place that we would apply this America First policy? Well, presumably we would apply it against a country that A, spent most of 2016 interfering in our internal affairs, trying to change the outcome of a sovereign American election, and B, a country with which we don't actually trade very much, and so applying sanctions wouldn't hurt us, although it would hurt them. That country is Russia, right? If Mr. Trump were at all serious about America first, if there really were a policy where the United States were going to use trade instruments against other countries that were intent on hurting the United States, America first would be directed against Russia. But it's not. On the contrary, no matter what Americans think, and no matter what Congress votes, right? We have massive majorities, massive bipartisan Republican Democrat majorities for sanctions against Russia. No matter what Americans think and no matter what their legislators do, there is no America First policy vis-a-vis Russia. What the White House actually does with sanctions is much more strongly correlated with what Russian bankers say than with what the American Congress says, right? And that's the third con of America First. There is no America First in this way as well. It's not about America vis-a-vis other countries. It's about Mr. Trump. It's about Mr. Trump. It's about Mr. Trump himself alone. It's about the relationships with which he feels comfortable, regardless of whether that hurts most of the population, regardless of the fact that that completely undermines any notion of American leadership, and regardless of the total contradiction of not wanting to apply sanctions to Russia. Russia is where the complete hollowness, the complete emptiness, the complete vacuum of America First, it most clearly appears. It's not America First. It's me first. And there's only one me, right? It's not A-M-E-R-I-C-A. It's just me. It's just M-E first. That's it. And there's just one me, and he's in the Oval Office. And it's his relationship with Russia, which is the third con. The third way that you can see America First is nothing but a con. Thanks.